The night the coffin sank into the red Louisiana mud, the rain didn't fall, it wept. Thick, heavy drops clung to the magnolia leaves, sliding down like tears too heavy to hold. The mourners stood in a circle, faces hidden under black veils, their silence broken only by the hiss of the wind through the moss. Among them was a woman whose gloved hand trembled as she let a single white camellia fall onto the coffin lid. No one saw the way her eyes followed it down. No one noticed the small forbidden prayer on her lips. Her name was Evelyn Rousseau, and though the world believed she was burying her husband that night, her heart was mourning another man entirely. The man she was never allowed to love. The man lying beneath the wood and earth of another man's name. Sometimes, the ground remembers what people try to forget. And in this small Louisiana parish, where secrets rot slower than bodies, that truth was about to rise back up through the soil. Before we go deeper into this chilling story, make sure you stay until the end, because the truth about what really happened between Evelyn Rousseau and the man they buried in her husband's grave is something most people can't bear to hear. The Rousseau estate sat high above the bayou, its white columns streaked with years of rain and rust, its windows clouded like the eyes of an old ghost that refused to forget. Every evening, when the sun slipped beneath the horizon, the house seemed to hold its breath. Cicadas filled the silence that people were too afraid to break. From a distance, it looked like peace. But peace in Louisiana never came without a story buried beneath it. Evelyn Rousseau stood on the veranda, her fingers brushing the chipped edge of a marble balustrade, watching the last blush of daylight fade from the fields. The air smelled of tobacco and damp soil, sweet and heavy, like a perfume meant to conceal decay. The men had finished their day's work hours ago, their songs fading as they walked back toward the quarters. But Evelyn lingered, long after the lamps were lit inside, as if waiting for someone she knew wouldn't come. Inside the house, everything was arranged precisely as Henry preferred it. The portraits stared from their frames with disapproving grace, her husband's ancestors, men carved from arrogance and ownership. Their eyes followed her as she walked the halls, reminding her of her place, her duties, her silence. The piano, untouched for months, still carried the faint scent of lavender oil and dust. She thought of playing again, but her hands felt too heavy. Music had no place in a house built on obedience. Henry Rousseau had been gone for 3 weeks. He was supposed to return from Baton Rouge the following morning, though Evelyn had stopped counting the days. His absence was a relief dressed as worry, a hollow she could breathe inside. In his presence, the house was all noise. His voice, his orders, the sound of doors closing behind him. Without him, it was only her heartbeat and the whisper of moth wings against glass. She walked past the dining room, its long mahogany table gleaming beneath the chandelier. The silver still caught the lamplight in narrow, trembling reflections. She paused at the head of the table where Henry's chair stood, pushed in neatly, untouched. There were nights she imagined him there, eyes narrowed, hand tapping against the wood in quiet judgment. She could almost hear him say her name, Evelyn, as if it were a sin. A draft swept through the hallway, carrying with it the smell of the garden, wet earth and crushed magnolia. She followed it instinctively, her steps soft on the marble floor. Outside, the night was pale with moonlight. The fields shimmered faintly beyond the iron gate, the bayou glinting like a dark mirror. She heard a sound, just a faint rhythm of movement, the kind that doesn't belong to the wind. Someone was still out there. Her heart quickened, though she didn't yet know why. She stepped off the veranda and into the damp grass, the hem of her dress gathering dew. Between the shadows of the cypress trees she saw him, a man bent low over the soil, turning it with steady precision. The lantern beside him cast an amber circle, his silhouette sharp against the darkness. He was new, she remembered. One of the hands brought in after the last flood ruined the fields. She had seen him once before, just long enough to notice that his silence carried the same weight as her own. He straightened suddenly, as if sensing her gaze. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment, everything around them seemed to still. The wind stopped. Even the crickets held their breath. Evelyn should have turned away, should have returned to the safety of her empty rooms, but something in the man's eyes pinned her in place. There was no defiance there, no fear, only recognition. As if he already knew her loneliness, as if he'd seen it before. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The moment passed, fragile as a moth wing brushing flame. He lowered his gaze and returned to his work, his movements unhurried. Evelyn watched a little longer, her throat tight with something she couldn't name, then turned back toward the house. The clock struck 9 when she reached her room. She sat by the window, the candle's flame trembling beside her, and opened her journal, a habit she'd abandoned long ago at Henry's insistence. The paper was yellowed, the ink nearly dry. She wrote slowly, as though relearning the shape of her own thoughts. The house feels different tonight. Lighter, as if someone breathed air into a room that's been sealed for too long. She paused, listening to the night. Somewhere far off, she thought she heard the faint sound of humming, a low, wordless tune drifting from the garden. It might have been the wind. It might have been him. Her hand hesitated over the page before she closed the journal and set it aside. She looked out the window once more. The lantern in the garden was still burning, a lone circle of gold in the darkness. She should have blown out her candle. She should have slept, but she didn't. Outside, the magnolia leaves shimmered under the moon, and the house on the hill watched quietly, as if it already knew that this was the night everything began to change. Morning in Louisiana was never gentle. It came like a slow ache, steam rising from the earth, light dripping through the trees like honey too thick to fall clean. The air clung to everything, lace curtains, linen sheets, the inside of Evelyn's lungs. The cicadas began their morning song before dawn, and by the time she opened her eyes, the world was already awake. She rose quietly, dressing in pale cotton, her fingers moving through motions that once came easily. Henry had always liked her immaculate, her hair pinned, her dress pressed, her words chosen like pearls. But he wasn't here, and for the first time in months, she didn't tighten her corset so hard it bruised. She left a loose curl resting on her neck, as if to test how rebellion might feel in daylight. From the veranda, she could see the fields stretching to the horizon, green and gold in the haze. The workers moved slowly in the heat, their tools catching the morning light. And then there he was again, Samuel. His movements were different from the others, unhurried but precise, like a man who had learned to live quietly inside his own cage. Evelyn told herself she was only observing, that she was merely making sure the garden, Henry's pride and joy, was being tended properly. But she knew better. She felt the truth in her pulse. By noon, the air was heavy enough to taste. She took refuge beneath the veranda's shadow, a pitcher of water at her side, pretending to read. The book lay open in her lap, unread. Her eyes kept drifting toward the garden. He was there again, shirt clinging to his back, the muscles in his arms catching the sun like bronze. When he straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, his eyes flickered briefly toward her, and this time he didn't look away. "Ma'am." His voice was low, careful. The word carried both respect and warning, as if he was reminding them both of where they stood. She startled slightly, though she'd been waiting for it. "Samuel, isn't it?" she asked, her tone too calm to be honest. "Yes, ma'am." "You work hard." He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the soil at his feet. "Work's all I know, ma'am." Something in the way he said it, a softness under the resignation, caught her breath. She wanted to ask more, but footsteps echoed behind her. One of the maids, old Clara, came out carrying a tray of lemonade and suspicion. "Miss Evelyn," Clara said, setting the tray down. Her tone was polite, but her eyes lingered too long on Samuel. "You best not stay out in this heat too long. You'll get faint." Evelyn nodded, though the message beneath the words was clear. Appearances. Always appearances. When Clara disappeared back inside, the silence between Evelyn and Samuel thickened, fragile and forbidden. "You should rest, ma'am," he said softly. "Sun's cruel today." Evelyn gave a small, humorless smile. "Cruel, yes, but honest." He looked up, puzzled. "It doesn't pretend to be kind," she added. then rose before she could say anything more foolish. That night, she couldn't sleep. The air was too close, her skin sticky with heat and thought. She wandered down to the garden barefoot, her white nightdress trailing like mist behind her. The moon was full, silvering the rows of flowers. Somewhere in the dark, a frog croaked. The scent of wet soil clung to her like memory. She found him by the cypress tree, exactly where she knew he'd be. He was sitting with his back to her, mending a broken wooden handle by lantern light. She should have turned back. Every step forward was a crime in waiting. But she couldn't make herself stop. He heard her approach and froze, his hand stilling mid-motion. "You shouldn't be here, ma'am. Neither should you." Her voice surprised her, steady, almost teasing. He turned, eyes glinting in the amber glow. "If they see you here, then they'll see me," she interrupted softly. "And they'll talk. They always talk." He stared at her for a long moment, the space between them humming with something dangerous and alive. "Why do you come out here?" he asked finally. She looked down at the dirt between them. "Because it's the only place that doesn't feel like this." The words trembled as they left her. She hadn't meant to say them aloud, but once they existed, they filled the air with truth. Samuel's jaw tightened. For a heartbeat, the world felt suspended, the insects quiet, the trees listening. "You should go back inside," he said. His tone was gentle, but his eyes betrayed him. They were too soft, too knowing. "I will," she whispered. Soon, but she didn't move. Neither did he. The night stretched between them, endless and charged. When she finally turned to leave, her heart was a drum against her ribs. Behind her, she heard him breathe her name, barely more than a whisper swallowed by the dark. It was the first time anyone had spoken her name without ownership in it. And it was the moment she realized she was already lost. The days that followed slipped by like silk through trembling fingers, slow, soft, and dangerous. The plantation's rhythm continued, as it always did, indifferent to the storms building inside its walls. The sun rose, the men worked, and Evelyn moved through her days with the poise of a woman rehearsing her own disguise. Every smile, every calm greeting, every meal served at the long oak table became an act of quiet theater. Yet beneath that practiced grace, something restless had begun to take root. The nights were worse. She would lie awake long after the lamps were snuffed, staring at the ceiling as the wind brushed against the shutters. Somewhere out there, Samuel existed in the same darkness, breathing, working, dreaming perhaps, and knowing that was enough to keep her pulse quickened and her conscience awake. She told herself that what had happened between them, or rather what hadn't, was harmless. A conversation in the garden, a name spoken like prayer, nothing more. But the mind has a way of returning to the places it shouldn't linger. When she poured her tea in the morning, she thought of the warmth of his hands. When she brushed her hair before bed, she remembered the sound of his voice, the way it seemed to carry the weight of a man who'd learned the language of restraint too well. It began with the letters. At first, they were only fragments, thoughts she couldn't speak aloud. She wrote them in secret, on thin paper she tore from her husband's old ledger books. "Sometimes I think the house knows me better than anyone alive. It listens when I cannot bear my own silence." She never wrote his name. That would have been too dangerous, too final. Instead, she wrote to the air, to the part of the world that might understand what it means to love something you're forbidden even to name. She hid the letters beneath the floorboards of her dressing room, beside a box of keepsakes Henry had forbidden her to keep, a dried magnolia blossom, a ribbon, a broken brooch. They became her private confessions, her rebellion written in ink instead of blood. But the house noticed. One afternoon, while Evelyn was arranging lilies in a vase, Clara lingered in the doorway. "You been writing again, Miss Evelyn?" she asked, her tone cautious but edged with worry. Evelyn looked up too sharply. "What makes you ask that?" Clara lowered her gaze. "Found ink stains on the floor by your vanity. Thought you stopped that long time ago." The words sent a chill through her. "Perhaps I started again?" Clara hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Just be careful, ma'am. Paper's lighter than air, but it burns faster than truth." That night, Evelyn locked her door and lifted the floorboard. The letters were still there, untouched. But her hands trembled as she read them, as though she could feel the fire waiting in every word. Outside, the crickets sang their restless hymn. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the dull rhythm of wood against stone, the sound of Samuel splitting logs by the barn. Each strike echoed through the night like a heartbeat she wasn't supposed to hear. The next evening she saw him again. He was repairing a fence post along the edge of the field when she approached, pretending to inspect the roses. The late afternoon light made everything gold, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and sweat. "You shouldn't be near the fields alone," he said, without looking up. And yet, here I am. He paused then, leaning on the post, his face glistening with heat and sunlight. "Why do you risk it, ma'am?" She smiled faintly. "Perhaps I'm tired of being told what's dangerous." For a long moment, he said nothing. The wind picked up, carrying the hum of insects and the faraway cry of a heron. Then he said, barely audible, "Danger's not always what they tell you it is." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the air between them turned molten. Then he stepped back, breaking the spell. Someone could see, she swallowed hard. Then let them, but neither of them moved closer. That was the cruelest part. How love, when forbidden, grows strongest in distance. Later that night, a sound startled her awake. A creak outside her window, a faint rustle near the magnolia tree. She rose and peered out. There was no one there, only the long shadow of the branches swaying in the moonlight. Yet she could have sworn she heard footsteps fading toward the garden. By morning, she found something new beneath the veranda, a single white camellia resting on the wood. Freshly cut, dew still clinging to its petals. No note, no signature, just silence, and a truth that no longer needed words. From that day forward, the air in the house changed. Whispers began to ripple among the staff, the kind that live in the corners of rooms and die when doors open. Henry's name began to appear more often in Evelyn's letters, not from longing, but from fear. She didn't know it yet, but somewhere in Baton Rouge, her husband had begun to hear whispers of his own. Stories about a wife who smiled too softly at the wrong man. And though neither of them could see it, the storm was already on its way. The sky broke open just after sundown. What began as a low murmur of thunder turned into a roar that swallowed the horizon whole. Rain fell in sheets, washing the red earth clean of its sins, or trying to. The Rousseau estate shuddered under the weight of it, windows rattling, roof groaning, the scent of wet magnolia filling every room. Evelyn stood at the top of the staircase, staring out through the tall glass doors, her reflection flickering each time lightning split the sky. Henry was due back that night. The letter had arrived 2 days earlier, short, clipped, and cold. "I return Friday. Keep the house in order. No signature, no warmth, only command." It had been months since they'd last shared a meal without silence pressing between them. She should have been preparing his study, airing the linen, arranging the brandy. Instead, she was standing barefoot on the marble floor, transfixed by the storm outside, her mind somewhere else, down near the river, where the world felt honest and cruel in equal measure. The wind carried a sound through the rain, hooves, wheels on gravel. Her heart lurched. For a moment she thought Henry had returned early. But when she stepped outside, lantern in hand, the drive was empty. The storm had fooled her, echoing its ghosts through the trees. She exhaled shakily and turned back toward the house, but something made her pause. Through the downpour, far beyond the garden, a faint light glimmered, moving. The river. Without thinking, she lifted her skirt and ran. Mud splashed against her legs, rain soaking through her dress, the storm swallowing her name each time she gasped it. Branches whipped against her arms as she stumbled through the cypress grove. She didn't know what she was looking for, only that something inside her knew where to go. The river was swollen, dark as ink. Its current thrashed against the roots of the trees, wild and furious. Through the sheets of rain, she saw him, Samuel, wading in chest-deep water, trying to free a wagon that had overturned near the bend. One of the oxen had broken loose. The other was drowning, its cries muffled by thunder. "Samuel!" she screamed, though her voice was barely a breath beneath the storm. He turned, startled, water slicking his skin like bronze. "Get back to the house!" he shouted, his words nearly lost to the rain, but she was already moving closer, the mud sucking at her feet. "You'll be swept away? I've done this before," he called back, his hand gripping the reins. But the current surged, and in an instant, the world tilted. The wagon shifted, the horse panicked, and Samuel was pulled beneath the torrent. Evelyn didn't think. She threw herself forward, the cold hitting her like glass. The current tore at her skirts, dragging her down, spinning her until the world blurred into black and lightning. She reached out blindly, her hands searching for his, and then she found him. His fingers locked around hers, strong, desperate, pulling her up into air and chaos. They stumbled toward the bank together, coughing, gasping, clutching at roots and mud. The rain didn't stop. It came harder, as if trying to drown them back into silence. They collapsed beneath the cypress, chests heaving, faces inches apart. For a long time, neither spoke. Only their breaths filled the space between thunder. Evelyn felt his hand still gripping hers, rough, shaking, alive. When she looked at him, lightning illuminated his face, the rain tracing down his jaw like tears. "You shouldn't have come," he said hoarsely. "And leave you to die?" "I've been dying all my life, ma'am," he murmured. "Just not like this." She closed her eyes, the weight of his words sinking deep. Somewhere inside her, something broke, and something else was born. The boundaries that had once held her together began to dissolve, washed away with the rain. She reached out, brushing her fingers against his cheek, her touch hesitant but certain. "Don't call me ma'am," she whispered. He hesitated, then said her name like it was the first word he'd ever learned. "Evelyn." It wasn't a kiss, not yet. It was the silence before one, the unbearable nearness of souls that had already chosen each other long before the world could stop them. The river roared behind them, a witness too ancient to judge. When they finally pulled apart, the rain had softened to a mist. The storm had spent itself, but the damage was done. They sat there in the mud and quiet, her head resting against his shoulder, his arm around her like an instinct too deep to unlearn. Neither spoke of what it meant. There were no promises, no vows, only the trembling understanding that nothing between them could ever return to what it was. When they rose to their feet, the dawn was already bleeding through the clouds. Evelyn's dress clung to her body, her hair tangled, her hands raw from the current. Samuel watched her as she walked back toward the estate, her figure ghost-like against the morning fog. He didn't follow. Not yet. In her room, Evelyn lit a candle with shaking hands. The flame flickered weakly, casting her reflection in the mirror, mud-streaked, wild-eyed, alive. She didn't look like Henry's wife anymore. Outside, the river kept moving, carrying away the pieces of who she'd been. But the house, that jealous old thing, had seen it all. And in the days to come, it would not keep her secret quietly. The next morning arrived with a sun too bright, too cruel, as if it wanted to expose every secret the storm had washed loose. The fields glittered wet, the river ran lower, but inside the Rousseau estate the air felt swollen with something unspoken. Evelyn woke to the distant echo of carriage wheels rolling up the drive, and for the first time in weeks her breath caught in her throat. Henry Rousseau had returned. The sound of his boots striking the floorboards traveled through the house like thunder. Slow, heavy, sure of its dominion. By the time he reached the parlor, Evelyn had composed herself into the shape of a dutiful wife. Her hair pinned, her dress clean, her face pale but calm. Only her hands betrayed her, trembling ever so slightly as she smoothed the folds of her skirt. When Henry entered, the room seemed to shrink. He was tall, broad, the kind of man whose presence filled every silence. The journey had aged him. His jaw was unshaven, his eyes darker than she remembered. He did not greet her with warmth or even pretense. Instead, he removed his gloves with deliberate slowness, his gaze raking over her as though searching for something misplaced. "You've kept the place in order," he said finally. His voice carried that familiar edge, control disguised as civility. "Yes," Evelyn answered softly. "Everything is as you left it." He nodded, though his eyes drifted toward the window, toward the fields where Samuel worked among the others. His stare lingered a fraction too long. "You hired new hands," he remarked. "It was necessary after the flood," she replied. "Half the garden was ruined." He made a low sound, not quite a hum, not quite agreement. "Floods do that. They reveal what the ground's been hiding." Evelyn felt her stomach twist. There was nothing in his tone that accused her of anything, yet the words landed like a blade pressed gently to the throat, just enough to warn, not enough to draw blood. That evening the house gathered for supper. The clatter of cutlery, the faint hum of Clara serving, the rhythmic ticking of the clock, all ordinary sounds that suddenly felt unbearable. Henry's questions came casually at first, about the accounts, the supplies, the harvest. Then he began asking about the workers, their names, their schedules, who oversaw them when he was gone. Evelyn answered carefully, feeling the noose of conversation tightening. When he finally mentioned Samuel, that tall one, the quiet one near the garden. "Where's he from?" She nearly dropped her spoon. "I don't know," she said too quickly. "He came from one of the river plantations. Mr. Clark sent him, I believe." Henry smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "You seem to know a great deal about him." She felt heat rise to her face. "I know what any mistress should." "Nothing more." He leaned back, studying her. The candlelight threw his features into sharp planes, shadow-carving cruelty where patience once lived. "I'll see about that," he murmured. After dinner, she escaped to her room under the excuse of a headache. But she didn't rest. She stood by the window, watching Henry move across the courtyard, his lantern swaying like an omen. He stopped near the garden, speaking to one of the overseers, then to Samuel himself. She couldn't hear the words, only the tone, sharp, commanding, dangerous. Samuel stood tall, his hands steady, but Evelyn saw the tension in his shoulders, the stillness of a man who knows one wrong word could end him. When Henry finally turned back toward the house, the lantern light flashed across his face. He was smiling. That smile haunted her all night. By morning, the household had shifted. The workers moved quieter, the maids avoided Evelyn's gaze, and the overseer's whip cracked more often than before. Henry seemed to take particular interest in the garden now, spending long hours there, pretending to inspect the roses, asking about soil, fertilizer, routine. He was searching. For what, she didn't yet know. She tried to speak to Samuel, but the chance never came. Each time she approached, someone was watching. The distance between them had become a wall of eyes. Once, in the hallway outside the study, she passed Henry as he was leaving, the smell of tobacco thick in the air. His hand brushed her shoulder. Too gentle, too deliberate. "Be careful where you walk," he said quietly. "The floors remember everything." That night, Evelyn sat by the fire long after everyone had gone to bed. Her journal lay open on her lap, but she couldn't write. Every sound in the house seemed louder, the groan of beams, the sigh of the wind, the faint murmur of her husband pacing 2 rooms away. She felt trapped inside her own home, her heart beating in a rhythm she no longer controlled. Outside, the moon hung low and white over the bayou, a single reflection trembling in the black water. Somewhere in that darkness, Samuel was still awake. She could almost feel it, the weight of his fear, the pull of his restraint. For the first time, Evelyn understood that love, once found, doesn't free you. It binds you, to danger, to silence, to every secret that can undo you. And Henry Rousseau, she realized, had begun to smell the blood beneath the perfume. The nights that followed blurred into each other, as if time itself had lost its edges. The plantation, once humming with routine, now throbbed with quiet dread. Henry had begun rising before dawn, patrolling the grounds with the overseer, claiming he couldn't sleep. He questioned servants about tools, about tasks, about who went where and when. Nothing escaped his notice. Not the missing candles in the corridor, not the faint smell of jasmine near the garden gate, not the way Evelyn's hands trembled each time Samuel's name was mentioned. Evelyn lived those days as if balancing on glass. Every word she spoke felt like a step that could shatter everything. Every silence felt like confession. When Henry wasn't watching her, she could feel the echo of his gaze, like a chill that lingered on her skin long after he'd gone. Once, in the small hours before sunrise, she crept into the garden. The mist was thick, the air heavy with damp earth and magnolia. She found Samuel there, kneeling by the hedge, his hands deep in the soil. He didn't startle when she whispered his name. He had felt her presence long before she spoke. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low, but softer than fear. "I had to see you," she breathed. "He's watching you." "I know." His calmness frightened her more than Henry's temper ever could. It wasn't denial. It was acceptance, like a man who'd already seen the end of his story and made peace with it. She knelt beside him, her skirt gathering dew, her hands clutching his sleeve. "I'll protect you," she said. "I swear it." Samuel looked at her then, really looked. And in that gaze was both love and sorrow, entwined like vines on a crumbling wall. "You can't protect me, Miss Evelyn," he said quietly. "You can't even protect yourself." The words sank into her chest like stones. She wanted to argue, to insist that love could conquer cruelty, but the wind itself seemed to silence her. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked open. Footsteps. She rose, heart pounding, and slipped back toward the house, leaving Samuel in the mist. When she reached the back porch, she saw Henry standing by the window, a candle in his hand. He wasn't looking at her, not yet. But the flame illuminated his face just enough for her to see the suspicion carved deep in his eyes. The next day, he summoned Samuel to the stables. Evelyn didn't know why. She watched from her chamber window as the two men stood apart, the air between them thick with tension. Henry spoke slowly, almost lazily, but his posture, upright, unyielding, told another story. Samuel kept his head down, his answers measured, his hands still. Then Henry took a step closer. Another. Until he was so near that even from her window, Evelyn could see the cruel curve of his mouth. That night, Samuel didn't return to the servants' quarters. No one saw him eat, no one saw him rest. Evelyn asked Clara where he'd gone, and Clara hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the door before whispering, "The stables." He made him sleep there. The thought hollowed her. That man, the one who had saved her from loneliness, who had seen her for more than the porcelain wife she pretended to be, now lay on the cold floor of a stable because her husband wanted to prove his ownership of both man and wife. She wanted to run to him. She wanted to defy everything. But Henry was awake, reading by the fire, his revolver on the table beside him, as if daring her to move. At midnight, she lit a single candle and crept out. The rain had begun again, soft at first, then harder, until it masked her footsteps. When she reached the stables, she found Samuel sitting against a beam, his shirt torn, his lips split, his expression unreadable. She knelt beside him, holding the candle between them. The small flame trembled in the draft, throwing shadows across his face. "What did he do?" she whispered. "Nothing that hasn't been done before," he said, with a quiet kind of dignity that broke her heart more than any scream could. She wanted to touch his cheek, but he caught her wrist gently. "Don't," he said. "If he sees this light, it'll be the last thing either of us ever see." Her throat ached. "Then what do we do?" He looked at her for a long moment. "You live. That's all you can do." The candle flickered, sputtered, then went out. Darkness swallowed them whole. For a heartbeat, Evelyn thought she could still see him, the faint outline of his face, the ghost of his warmth. And then he was gone, lost to the night. When she returned to the house, she found Henry standing in the hallway, still awake, the glow of the fire behind him. His expression was unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice too calm. "I needed air." He nodded, stepping closer until she could smell the smoke on his breath. "You smell like rain," he said, and brushed his thumb across her cheek, leaving a faint trace of ash. Then he smiled. "Get some rest, my dear. Tomorrow will be a long day." Evelyn walked away, her heart thrumming with dread. She didn't know what he meant, but she knew that smile. It was the same one he wore the night before his father's dog disappeared. A smile that promised something was about to die. And for the first time, she feared that love itself might not survive the morning. The next morning dawned with the scent of iron and wet moss in the air. A low fog clung to the riverbank, heavy and unmoving, like a breath the land refused to release. Evelyn stood at her window long before sunrise, her fingers gripping the sill until her knuckles whitened. The world outside looked drained of color, just shades of gray and stillness. Somewhere beyond the fog, a crow cried out, and its echo carried across the fields like an omen. Henry was already awake. She heard his voice through the floorboards, commanding, sharp, speaking to the overseer about boundaries, about discipline, about order. Every word he spoke seemed less about the plantation and more about reminding everyone that he ruled this land, and everything that breathed upon it. By breakfast, the atmosphere was suffocating. The house servants moved like ghosts, silent, cautious. Clara served coffee without looking up once. Henry read from a ledger at the table, pretending not to notice the fear that filled the room. When Evelyn tried to speak, her voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "Where's Samuel?" she asked, quietly but clearly. Henry didn't look up. "In the field," he replied. "Where he belongs." The words were sharp enough to draw blood. Evelyn's spoon trembled against her cup, and the faint ring of porcelain on porcelain echoed like a scream. She rose from the table before she could stop herself. "I'm going for a walk," she said. He finally looked up, his gaze slow, deliberate. "Be careful, darling," he said with that thin smile that never reached his eyes. "The ground's still soft from the rain. People tend to sink when they're not careful." She left without another word. The fog outside wrapped around her like a shroud. The air was cold, damp enough to sting. Every step she took squelched in the mud, each sound swallowed by the mist. She moved toward the far edge of the property, where the cypress trees grew in tangled knots, their roots curling out of the ground like the fingers of buried hands. It was there she found him, Samuel, working alone, driving a shovel into the earth that seemed too stubborn to yield. He didn't look up when she approached, but she saw the way his shoulders tensed, the slight tremor in his hands. When he finally turned, his face was pale beneath the sweat, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion and something darker. Fear, maybe, or resignation. "He's watching everything," he said before she could speak. "Even when you think he isn't." "I know," she whispered. "But he can't—" "Yes, he can," Samuel cut in softly. "You know that as well as I do." She wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. The truth was there, between them, as real as the mud under their feet. Henry's control reached everywhere, the fields, the servants, the air itself. And now, it reached into the fragile things she and Samuel had built in stolen glances and whispered nights. A sudden crack split the air, a whip striking somewhere in the distance. Both of them flinched. The sound carried through the fog, then faded into silence, leaving the world still again. Evelyn stepped closer. "There has to be a way," she said. "We can leave. There's a train in town. He shook his head. "You can't outrun a man like him." "Not when the law's his shadow," she swallowed hard. "Then what do we do?" Samuel's gaze lifted past her, toward the distant house. "Sometimes the only way to stop a storm is to let it break." Before she could ask what he meant, a figure appeared through the mist. The overseer, tall and broad, a rifle slung over his shoulder. His eyes narrowed at the sight of them standing so close. "Miss Evelyn," he said stiffly, "Mr. Rousseau's asking for you." Evelyn's heart dropped. What for? He didn't say. The man's tone carried something almost like pity. She glanced once at Samuel. His expression didn't change, but she saw his jaw tighten, saw the smallest shake of his head. A silent plea not to argue. She turned back toward the house, the overseer following a few paces behind. Each step felt heavier than the last. The fog thickened, swallowing the path, the fields, the trees, until even the sound of the river vanished. When she reached the porch, Henry was waiting. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Out walking again? He asked, his tone light but cutting. I needed air, she said. He stepped closer, his eyes flicking over her dress, the mud on her hem, the tremor in her breath. And you found it with one of the workers? Her throat went dry. I was checking the fields, she said carefully. Of course, he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. A lady of your standing, walking through mud to check on crops. How noble. She opened her mouth to respond, but he pressed a finger gently to her lips. Don't, he whispered. Not yet. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there in the doorway, her heart beating like something trapped in a cage. That night, she dreamt of the cypress trees, of roots curling like serpents, of whispers rising from the soil. In her dream, Samuel's voice echoed through the fog, saying her name over and over, fading with every repetition until it became nothing but the sound of wind through dead leaves. When she woke, her pillow was wet with tears she didn't remember shedding. The house was silent, too silent. And somewhere in the distance, a crow screamed again, louder this time, as if it had seen what morning would bring. Evelyn rose, lit a candle, and pressed her palm to the cold window pane. Outside, the fog hadn't lifted, and for the first time, she understood that something terrible had already begun. By noon, the fog had thinned, but the dread it carried had not. The air seemed clearer only to mock the heaviness inside the house. Every room felt watched, every shadow seemed to breathe. Evelyn moved like a ghost between walls that had once been her refuge, now turned into a prison built from her own choices. Henry spent the morning in his study, the door closed, his voice occasionally cutting through the silence as he dictated letters to someone unseen. His tone was calm, measured, too calm. It was the kind of quiet that meant something was coming. Something final. Evelyn tried to keep herself busy. She instructed Clara to change the linens, walked through the garden, pretended to inspect the flowers that had begun to rot in the damp. But her eyes kept drifting toward the stables. She couldn't see Samuel, but she could feel him there. The pull of his presence, the ache of his absence. By afternoon, Henry called for her. She found him seated at his desk, a decanter of brandy half empty beside him, papers spread like weapons. He didn't look up when she entered. Close the door, he said. She obeyed, though her hands trembled against the brass handle. Henry leaned back in his chair, studying her the way one studies a painting, searching for cracks beneath the varnish. Do you love him? The question came so suddenly she forgot to breathe. She stared, caught between the instinct to deny and the futility of pretending. Her silence spoke before she could. Henry smiled, a thin, tired smile that frightened her more than rage ever could. I thought so, he said softly. I've seen the way you look at him. The way your eyes follow him even when you think they don't. Henry, he raised a hand, silencing her. You know what's funny, Evelyn? I always thought betrayal would come from an enemy. But it's the ones we keep closest who bury the knife where it hurts the most. He rose from his chair slowly, almost tenderly, and walked around the desk. She could smell the brandy on his breath, the faint smoke from his cigar. His fingers brushed her chin, lifting it until she met his gaze. I loved you, he said. In my own way, and maybe I still do. But you've made me a fool, and I can't let that stand. Her voice broke. Please? He stepped closer, pressing his finger against her lips again. No, not please. Not anymore. Then he turned away as if even looking at her burned him. He's gone, he said, The words hit her like a blow. What? You're Samuel, he said calmly. He left this morning. Didn't you hear? Took one of the horses. Must have decided he'd had enough of this place. She shook her head. No, he wouldn't. Henry poured another drink. Believe what you like, but he's not coming back. Her vision swam. The room tilted. She wanted to scream, to run, to claw the truth out of him, but all she could manage was a whisper. What did you do? Henry didn't answer. He simply sipped his drink, eyes fixed on the fire. You should rest, he said. It's been a long week. Evelyn stumbled out of the study, her legs weak, her pulse roaring in her ears. She ran through the hall, through the back door, across the wet grass toward the stables. The stall was empty, the tools scattered. The earth beneath the back fence was freshly turned, as if something, or someone, had been dragged across it. She fell to her knees in the mud. The smell of iron filled her lungs again. She clawed at the dirt, tearing her gloves, her fingernails blackened with soil. But there was nothing. Only the sound of her own breath and the echo of a crow circling overhead. Clara found her there an hour later, kneeling, shaking, her dress ruined, her hands bleeding. Miss Evelyn, she whispered, horrified. You can't let him see you like this. Evelyn looked up slowly, her face streaked with tears and dirt. He killed him. Clara hesitated, glancing toward the house. You don't know that. Yes, Evelyn said, her voice low, hollow. I do. That night she didn't eat, didn't speak. She sat by the window in her nightgown, staring at the fields that glowed pale under the moon. The air was still. Even the frogs had gone silent. Somewhere beyond the trees, she thought she saw movement, a flicker, a shadow. For a moment she imagined it was Samuel, walking toward her, alive, whole, waiting. But when she blinked, there was nothing. Only darkness, stretching wide and endless. She pressed her forehead against the glass, whispering his name as though the night itself could carry it to him. In that silence, she made a promise, not out loud, not even to herself, but deep inside the part of her that still burned. If Henry Rousseau had taken Samuel's life, she would take everything else he had left. She would become the ghost that haunted him, the wound that never healed, the shadow in every mirror he tried to face. Because love, once buried, does not die. It rots. It waits, and when it rises, it takes everything with it. The following days unfolded in a strange, suspended rhythm. Time no longer obeyed the sun. Morning bled into night without distinction, and the hours in between seemed to collapse into one long ache. Evelyn barely spoke. She drifted through the house like something half alive, her movements slow, deliberate, her silence more frightening than any scream could have been. Henry, on the other hand, was unnervingly calm. He resumed his routines as if nothing had happened, overseeing the fields, entertaining guests, even laughing with the overseer on the porch. But there was a new sharpness in him, a cruel ease, as though the act of cruelty had steadied him somehow. He had taken control again, and he was enjoying the quiet that came after breaking something precious. One afternoon, while arranging flowers in the parlor, Evelyn caught the faintest whiff of something, the earthy sweetness of lilies mixed with something darker, metallic, faintly burnt. It came from the garden, and though she knew she shouldn't, she followed it. The air outside was warm, thick with humidity, the kind that sticks to skin like guilt. The scent grew stronger as she neared the cypress grove. And then she saw it, a patch of freshly disturbed soil, half hidden behind the hedge. The lilies there were new, too new. Their petals glistened with dew that hadn't yet settled anywhere else. Her heart began to hammer. Evelyn knelt, touching the ground. The dirt was soft, damp, recently turned. Beneath it, faintly, she could smell the unmistakable trace of something that didn't belong to the garden, something that carried the memory of smoke, of endings. She didn't cry. She didn't even tremble. Instead, she straightened, brushed the dirt from her hands, and stared at the flowers. The white blooms trembled in the light breeze, pure, fragile, as if mocking her with their serenity. That night, she joined Henry for dinner. The table was lit with candles, their flames dancing lazily in the still air. The food was untouched. The wine glowed deep red in their glasses. "You've been quiet," Henry remarked, breaking the silence. "Have I?" He smiled faintly. "I was beginning to worry." "Don't," she said. "There's no need." He studied her for a moment, the corner of his mouth twitching. "You always were strongest when pretending." Evelyn looked at him, really looked. His face was handsome in that cold, angular way, but his eyes betrayed something fragile underneath. Not guilt. Never guilt. But the tremor of a man who'd gone too far and didn't yet realize what he'd unleashed. "You think you've buried him," she said quietly. "But you haven't." The knife in Henry's hand paused above his plate. He laughed. A soft, incredulous sound. "Buried who?" Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know." He set the knife down slowly. "Careful, my dear. Grief can make people imagine things." "Then let's imagine together," she said, her tone almost tender. "The soil behind the cypress trees. The lilies you planted there. The scent of ash you thought the rain would wash away." The room fell still. For the first time, Henry's composure faltered. Only slightly, but enough. His fingers twitched against the stem of his glass. "You should get some rest," he said. Evelyn smiled. It was small, almost kind, and it chilled him more than anger could have. "I already have," she said. "You're the one who won't." She rose from the table without another word, her chair scraping softly against the floor. As she walked away, Henry called after her, but she didn't turn. She didn't need to. The tremor in his voice was enough. Later, when the house had gone silent, she returned to the garden. The moon hung low, veiled by clouds, but its light was enough to silver the path. The lilies swayed gently in the breeze. Evelyn stood before them, her nightgown clinging to her in the damp air, and whispered his name, not Henry's, but Samuel's. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of lilies away, replacing it with the faintest trace of smoke, dry, distant, like the ghost of something long extinguished. "I won't let him rest," she whispered. "Not until you do." For a moment, the night seemed to listen. The branches above her rustled, and the moon broke through the clouds, spilling pale light across the soil. She thought she saw something glint there, a small button, half buried, darkened by dirt. She reached for it, brushing the soil away with trembling fingers. It was his. She remembered the stitching, the uneven thread she had mended herself one quiet evening when the world still felt kind. Evelyn pressed the button to her lips. Something inside her shifted. Not grief, not exactly. Something colder, steadier. A decision forming not from impulse, but from clarity. If Henry believed the dead could be silenced, he was wrong. Some voices whisper even beneath the earth. Some loves refuse to rot. When she returned inside, she extinguished every candle but one, the small one by the window overlooking the cypress grove. She left it burning through the night, a silent vigil. Henry Rousseau slept in the room down the hall, unaware that with every flicker of that flame, his time was burning away too. The lilies outside gleamed white beneath the moonlight, and somewhere beneath them the soil began to breathe. Rain came again that night, harder than before. A relentless storm that shook the windows and turned the garden into a mire of black water and drowned lilies. The wind howled through the shutters, and somewhere deep in the house, the beams groaned as if the wood itself remembered what lay buried beneath its foundations. Evelyn did not sleep. She sat in the parlor with a shawl around her shoulders, staring into the fire until it became a blur of orange ghosts. Henry had gone to bed hours earlier, his steps heavy up the staircase, his door closing with that measured finality that always made her skin crawl. But the storm seemed unwilling to let him rest. Every thunderclap sounded like a reckoning. Every flash of lightning split the night open to show her glimpses of something watching. Not from outside, but within the walls of that house. She could hear the river swelling beyond the fields, its current dragging at the earth like claws. And under the sound of rain, another noise. Faint, rhythmic, hollow. It took her several moments to understand what it was. The dull thump of floorboards shifting somewhere above. The kind of sound made by slow, deliberate footsteps. At first, she thought it was Henry. But then came a different sound. The creak of his bed frame, a muttered curse, and then silence. He was still in his room. Whoever was moving was somewhere else. Evelyn rose, her heart a small bird in her chest. She moved down the hallway barefoot, the cold seeping up through the floor. The lantern in her hand flickered weakly, its light bending against the drafts that whispered through the old house. As she passed the grand staircase, she froze. There were footprints, faint, wet, trailing up from the direction of the garden door. Her breath caught. The mud was fresh, dark against the polished wood. Drops of water glistened near the banister, leading toward the back of the hall. Slowly, she followed. The trail stopped at the base of the servants' staircase. The air there was colder, thicker. She could smell it. The river, the earth, and beneath it all, the faint scent of lilies crushed beneath a heel. Samuel. She whispered before she realized she'd spoken aloud. The name hung in the air, swallowed by the thunder. Something creaked above her. One step, then another. She lifted the lantern, her hand trembling. "Who's there?" No answer. Only the groan of wood and the rhythmic drip of water falling from the ceiling. She should have run, woken Henry, done anything but stand there. But the pull was too strong. That impossible hope that refused to die. She climbed. Each stair moaned under her weight, the sound of rain muffled to a dull heartbeat around her. When she reached the top, she saw it, a shadow moving at the end of the corridor, turning toward the east wing, toward Henry's room. "Stop," she whispered. Though her voice barely carried, the shadow didn't stop. It drifted, almost soundless, like the reflection of something walking underwater. Lightning split the hall. For a moment, the figure became clear. A man, his shirt torn, his skin slick with rain, his eyes hollow but alive with something that wasn't anger, wasn't peace. Just presence. Evelyn dropped the lantern. It shattered, spilling oil across the floor, flames licking briefly at the wood before dying in a hiss of rain leaking from the roof. When the light went out, the shadow was gone. Only the storm remained. From behind her, a door opened. Henry's voice came sharp and wary. "What the hell was that?" She turned. His face appeared in the dim glow of the hallway candles. Tired, irritated, unaware of what she'd seen. "Someone's in the house," she said. He frowned. "What are you talking about?" "The footsteps," she whispered. "The mud, But when she looked down, the trail was gone. The floor gleamed clean and dry. Henry stepped closer, his expression hardening. "You're shaking," he said. "You've been up too long, Evelyn. You're seeing things. I'm not." He caught her wrist, not roughly, but firmly enough that she felt the warning in it. "Go back to bed," he said. "That's an order." Something in his tone, the old authority, the cold certainty, snapped whatever restraint she had left. "You killed him," she hissed. "You think I don't know? You think you can hide that smell from me?" For a moment, he didn't speak. His hand loosened, then tightened again. "Careful," he said softly. "Madness runs quick in this family. You wouldn't want people talking." He let her go and turned back toward his room, his footsteps deliberate, steady. When the door closed behind him, Evelyn stood alone in the dark hall, her body trembling not from fear but from the unbearable quiet that followed. Then came the sound again, faint, distant, a single knock beneath the floorboards, not from above. From below, she sank to her knees, pressing her ear to the wood. The sound came again, a dull, hollow thud spaced by silence, then another, closer this time. It was coming from under the house, from where the river cut beneath the foundation, carving away at the soil. The floor seemed to breathe under her touch. And in that moment, Evelyn knew, whatever Henry had buried had not stayed still. The river was rising. The ground was shifting, and something Someone was coming back. By dawn, the rain had stopped, but the house had changed. It felt lighter somehow, hollowed out, as though the storm had taken something with it, or left something behind. The air was thick with the smell of wet wood and earth, and when Evelyn stepped onto the veranda, she saw that part of the garden had collapsed. The soil near the edge of the field had caved in, exposing the river below, now swollen and angry. The current tore through the roots of the old oak tree, its waters foaming with the color of rust. She stood at the railing, watching, her nightgown clinging to her legs. From here she could see the lilies floating on the surface, not the ones she'd planted, but wild ones, torn from the marsh and swept downriver. They drifted past in slow procession, their white petals bruised and broken. A funeral without music. Henry was already outside, standing near the pit where the ground had collapsed. He was shouting orders at the field hands, his boots sinking deep into the mud. His coat was unbuttoned, his hair damp and unkempt. He looked less like a master of the house now, and more like one of the men who worked for him, desperate and angry at the earth for not obeying. When he saw her, he waved the men away and started toward her. She could tell by his gait that he'd been drinking. The slight sway, the sluggish focus in his eyes. "Ground's washing out," he said when he reached her. "Damn river's eaten half the field overnight. The whole east side's going to give if this keeps up." Evelyn said nothing. Her eyes drifted to the jagged line of earth where the river had bitten through. Somewhere beneath that churning water lay the grave he'd dug, the lie he'd built the rest of his life upon. Henry followed her gaze, and for a flicker of a moment, she thought she saw it. That same awareness, the shadow of memory behind his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by irritation. "I'll have it filled," he muttered. "We'll shore the banks." "No one will—" "You can't cover the river," she said quietly. He looked at her, confused. "What?" "You can't bury what it wants to show." He stared at her for a long moment, then laughed, not kindly. "You're still dreaming, Evelyn. Talking like a poet when the world's falling apart around you." She turned to him, and for the first time her voice didn't shake. "The world's been falling apart since the night you killed him." He froze. The words hung between them like a blade. "What did you say?" "You think I didn't see you that night?" Her tone was low, steady, too calm to sound like hysteria. "You went out with the lantern after midnight. I heard the shovel. I smelled the earth when you came back. You didn't even wash your hands before you touched me." Henry's jaw tensed. His eyes darted toward the workers, making sure they were far enough away not to hear. "You don't know what you're saying," he hissed. "I know exactly what I'm saying." For a moment, neither of them moved. Only the river spoke, a steady, violent whisper gnawing at the land. Then Henry's voice softened, almost pleading. "Evelyn, listen to me. You're tired. You've been unwell. You think you saw something, but you didn't. Samuel, he left. He ran. That's the truth." She smiled then, a thin, lifeless thing. "Then why is he still here?" Henry's face went pale. "What?" "In the walls," she said. "In the floor. I hear him. You should too." Henry took a step back, his hand shaking slightly as he rubbed his temple. "Enough. You'll ruin yourself with this talk." "Do you understand? You'll ruin us both." He turned and stormed toward the barn, shouting for the men again. Evelyn stayed where she was, watching the pit. The water had begun to seep upward through the grass, bubbling in small, muddy bursts. The earth was moving, breathing. She knelt, pressing her fingers into the wet soil. It was softer than it should have been, trembling faintly beneath her touch. She dug just enough to see the pale gleam of wood, a board warped and splitting, its edge jutting through the earth like a broken tooth. A coffin. Or what was left of one. The river had found it. She stood, her breath coming fast. The garden, the lilies, the storm, all of it had been leading to this. The past was rising. That night she didn't sleep. She sat by the window, the lantern burning low, her eyes fixed on the dark shape of the field. The air hummed with something waiting, something inevitable. And then she heard it again. Faint, almost tender. The creak of a door downstairs. She didn't move. Didn't breathe. The sound of footsteps followed, wet and slow. The boards moaned under each step, and then silence. A moment later, she smelled it. Damp earth, lilies, and something else. The faint metallic sweetness of decay. A voice came, low and raw, from the foot of the stairs. "Evelyn," she froze. It wasn't Henry's voice. It was the voice of a man who'd been drowned, buried, and forgotten, and had come home to collect what was his. The name, her name, rolled through the house like a prayer carved from the depths of the river. Soft at first, then breaking against the walls as if the very wood remembered the sound. Evelyn's breath stopped. Every inch of her skin felt like it was listening. The voice had not changed. It was Samuel's, lower now, soaked with the hush of earth and water, but still carrying that calm gravity that had once steadied her trembling hands in the garden. For a long moment, she could not move. The world outside was silent, the storm having retreated into a bruise-colored dawn. The house, though, lived. Every stair, every joint, every breath of timber seemed to tighten around that sound. She rose from the chair, her fingers trembling as they reached for the banister. "Samuel," she whispered, as though afraid to disturb the air between them. The voice came again, closer this time. "Don't be afraid," her heart lurched. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a presence. A warmth, faint but familiar, filling the space behind her like someone standing near enough to touch. She turned slowly. The hallway was empty. The only light came from the dying lantern flame, its glow licking at the walls, shrinking with every flicker. She descended the stairs barefoot, her dress brushing against the floorboards that groaned under her weight. The smell grew stronger with each step. Lilies, damp wood, and river mud. The same scent that had haunted her dreams since the night he vanished. At the bottom of the stairs, the front door stood ajar. The wind pushed it open just enough for a silver line of morning to spill across the floor. Her throat tightened. Beyond the door, the world was mist. The field, the garden, the fallen oak, all hidden beneath a blanket of fog that moved like smoke. Somewhere in that shifting white, she could hear water trickling. "Evelyn," the voice said again, this time from outside. She stepped through the door. The wet grass bent under her feet, cold and soft, each blade heavy with dew. The fog curled around her like breath. She could barely see the porch behind her. "Samuel," she called again, her voice catching. "Where are you?" The fog stirred. From somewhere near the riverbank, a figure began to take shape. Not solid, not ghostly either, but something between. His outline wavered with the mist, his movements slow, deliberate. When the wind shifted, she saw his face. Samuel. He looked younger than he should have, untouched by the rot she'd feared. His skin carried the pallor of moonlight, and his eyes, God, his eyes, held the same quiet depth she had fallen into once and never truly climbed out of. She wanted to run to him, but her feet wouldn't move. Her voice broke as she whispered, "You came back." His expression didn't change. "You shouldn't have stayed here," he said. His words seemed to ripple the air, their echo trembling through her bones. "I couldn't leave you." He shook his head. "You weren't meant to see what he did." Her eyes burned. "But I did. I saw it all." Samuel took a slow step forward. The fog parted around him, and she saw the truth she hadn't wanted to see: his shirt, soaked and torn at the collar, the dark stain along his ribs that no river could wash away. Evelyn pressed a hand to her mouth, a sound caught between a sob and a prayer. "Why did he do it?" she whispered. "He could have let you go. We could have run." "You know why?" Samuel said quietly. And she did. Henry had loved her, once in his way, possessive, cruel, desperate to own what he couldn't understand. When he saw the truth between her and Samuel, it wasn't jealousy that drove him, but terror. The terror of losing control. "Evelyn," Samuel said again, softer now. He buried me under his land, but the river doesn't keep secrets. It remembers. The air shifted. Behind them, from the direction of the house, came the creak of a door opening, slow, deliberate. Henry! Samuel's gaze lifted past her shoulder. Evelyn turned. Her husband stood on the porch, still in his nightshirt, his face drained of all color. His eyes were fixed on the figure in the fog. "What in God's name?" Henry muttered. His voice faltered. He took one step down, then stopped. "Who's there?" Samuel didn't answer. He simply looked at him, that steady, unblinking look that once carried nothing but kindness. Now it carried judgment. Henry stumbled back a step, his breath catching. "No, you're dead." Evelyn turned toward her husband. "He's not dead," she said, her voice trembling but sure. "You never gave him peace." "Evelyn," Henry whispered, his eyes wide. "Come inside." "Please." But she didn't move. The fog thickened again, rising between them like a curtain. The river roared louder, the ground trembling beneath their feet. Henry shouted something she couldn't hear, a warning or a plea, and then the earth gave a low, hollow groan. The pit by the field split wider, spilling mud and water in a violent surge. Henry turned just in time to see the ground break open near the porch steps. He tried to steady himself, but the boards cracked, dragging him halfway down before he caught the railing. "Evelyn!" he screamed. "Help me!" She took one step forward, but Samuel's hand rose, not touching her, just stopping her in place. "He's made his bed," Samuel said quietly. "Let the river take what it's owed." Evelyn's heart twisted. "He's still alive?" Samuel's voice was low. "He's been dead longer than I have." Henry's cries grew fainter as the mud climbed higher, pulling him toward the gaping earth. The lilies, torn free from the garden, floated down into the pit, their petals folding in the current. When it was over, the river was quiet again. The fog began to thin, revealing the ruined porch, the collapsed field, and the coffin wood now half buried once more. Samuel turned to her. "It's done." Evelyn's tears ran silently. "Will you leave now?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I never left." She blinked. And he was gone. Only the sound of the river remained, steady and endless, whispering through the dawn like a confession no one would ever write down. Evelyn sank to her knees, her dress heavy with mud, her heart a hollow ache of love and loss. The fog drifted away, revealing a house that looked emptier than ever. But somehow she knew she wasn't alone. Not anymore. Days passed, though the world around Evelyn no longer felt tied to time. The house sat like a relic, half-eaten by damp and silence. The workers had fled. The neighbors stopped coming after word spread that the river had swallowed Henry Thorne whole. They said the land had cursed him, that the soil he built his fortune on finally decided to collect its due. Evelyn let them believe that. She barely spoke, barely moved. The days folded into one another like soft, heavy cloth. The mornings came pale and colorless, the evenings drowned in fog. The river ran high now, muttering to itself beneath the porch, its edges gnawing slowly at what was left of the garden. Each night she heard it, the shifting of stones, the restless groan of wood, as though the house itself was sliding closer to the current. But she did not leave. Something inside her refused to. The world she had lived in, all its rules, its manners, its prayers, had already been washed away. What was left was simpler, quieter, almost holy. She spent her hours near the window, staring at the field where the lilies once bloomed. Their stems were gone, but sometimes she thought she saw flashes of white floating along the river, petals, bones, memories. It didn't matter which. Once, she went down to the river's edge barefoot. The mud was cool. the water dark and slow. She knelt and placed her hands into it, feeling the pull of the current, the pulse of the earth. Her fingers brushed against something smooth beneath the surface, a piece of wood maybe, or the curve of stone. But when she looked closer, she saw it wasn't wood at all. It was a button, old tarnished brass, Henry's. Her breath caught. She turned it over in her palm, the river water running down her wrist like sweat. The current tugged harder, as if trying to reclaim it. She closed her fist around the button and whispered, "He's gone." The water answered. A soft ripple, almost like laughter. That night, she dreamed of Samuel again. Not the spectral figure in the fog, but the man as he was before, sitting on the porch steps, carving something small and careful from a block of cedar. He smiled when he saw her. "You stayed too long," he said gently. She wanted to tell him she couldn't leave, that the house still held too much of them, their voices, their touches, their guilt. But before she could speak, he placed the carving in her hands. It was a small bird, wings half spread, caught between rising and falling. When she woke, the carving lay beside her on the pillow, real, smooth, damp. Her heart raced. She touched the bird's wings, tracing every mark, every groove. The air smelled of river water again, faint but certain. Later, when she went downstairs, she found the footprints. They began at the front door, bare, wide, heavier than her own. They trailed across the foyer, through the hall, to the dining room. The mud they carried was red, like rust, and where the prints faded, the floorboards shimmered faintly with moisture. Evelyn didn't panic, not this time. She followed them, each step deliberate. The prints ended at the fireplace. Above the mantel hung the portrait of Henry, stern, proud, his eyes forever judging. She stared at it for a long time before reaching up to take it down. Behind it, the wall was cracked, thin lines branching out from a center like veins. She pressed her palm to it, and it gave a little under the pressure. Damp plaster, weakened by years of secrets. A drop of water trickled out. It was then she understood. The river wasn't done. She fetched a candle and watched as the flickering light caught the edges of the crack, revealing something beyond. Darkness and the faint glint of metal. She pressed harder until the plaster broke, revealing a hollow space inside the wall. There, wrapped in rotted fabric, was a small iron box. Her pulse quickened. She pulled it free, setting it on the table. The latch was rusted, but it opened with one sharp twist of a knife. Inside, she found letters, dozens of them, folded carefully, edges browned with age. Each one was addressed to her. Her fingers shook as she unfolded the first page. The handwriting was Samuel's. The words bled in places, the ink warped by damp, but the meaning was clear. He had written them in secret. Each letter was a confession, a record of love that dared not speak its name aloud. And in the last letter he wrote of the night Henry discovered their affair, how he planned to run, how he wanted to take her with him. But one line struck her like thunder. "If I am gone by dawn, it will be by his hand. And if I die here, I will not rest until you are free." Her tears fell onto the page. She realized then that the voice in the night, the footsteps, the breath on her neck, they weren't hauntings. They were promises, fulfilled at last. By the river, by the earth, by the ruin of everything that once held them apart. When the candle burned down to its base, she sat in the dark, the letters scattered around her like fallen leaves. The silence of the house was no longer heavy. It was sacred. Outside, the river murmured a lullaby to the dead, and for the first time in years, Evelyn closed her eyes and slept without fear. But as she drifted off, she dreamed of the water again, endless, dark, patient, whispering in a voice she almost recognized. There is still one more debt to be paid. The river rose again that week. It came quietly this time, without thunder or storm, without any reason at all. just a slow, steady claiming of the land, as though it had waited for everything else to fall silent before making its final move. The garden was gone now, replaced by a sheet of dark, glassy water that reached the porch steps. The house creaked and moaned in its bones, the floorboards warping beneath the weight of moisture. Evelyn didn't try to stop it. She watched it come with the same calm you'd give to something inevitable, something sacred. She had buried Henry's button in the garden 2 nights before, beneath the last surviving oak. The earth was soft, and when she pressed it into the soil, she whispered his name one final time. Not out of love, not even forgiveness, but to seal the story. Every name, she'd realized, deserved to end in the mouth of someone who had truly known it. Now the river was at her doorstep, whispering in its 1,000 voices. She could hear it in the walls, in the mirrors, in her blood. The whole house was becoming part of it, plank by plank, memory by memory. The wallpaper peeled like skin. The portraits on the walls began to fade, even Henry's, whose proud eyes now stared out as if half forgotten by the world he once ruled. Evelyn lit the last candle she had and carried it into the parlor. The letters lay spread across the table where she had left them. She had read them all again and again until she could recite each line from memory. They had become her gospel, her truth, her penance. Samuel's handwriting was firm in the early ones, growing softer toward the end. The ink thin and uncertain, like a voice fading in fog. She picked one up. The final letter, the one written on the night of his death. The edges were torn, the ink smeared. She read it aloud now, her voice trembling but clear. Evelyn, if the river takes me, it is not because I drowned. It is because he feared that I lived too loudly. But love cannot be drowned, my dearest. It only changes its shape. If you hear me after I am gone, know that I have not returned to haunt you. I have come to keep you from becoming what he was. When the river rises, follow it. It will show you the way home. Her tears fell, darkening the paper. She folded the letter and placed it back in the box, then lifted the candle and turned toward the door. The night outside was silver with mist, the river shining faintly in the distance. It was closer now. She could hear it breathing just beyond the porch. The floor creaked behind her. She froze. Evelyn, came the voice, not the echoing murmur from before, but warm, steady, heartbreakingly human. She turned. Samuel stood in the doorway, just as he had in life. No shadow, no blood, no wounds. Just the quiet strength she remembered. He smiled faintly. You kept the letters, she nodded. You told me to. He took a step forward, the candlelight catching his face. It's time, her throat tightened. Time for what? For you to leave this house. She looked around, at the walls, the furniture, the remnants of a life built on lies and longing. It's all I have left, Samuel's gaze softened. No, Evelyn. It's all that's been keeping you here. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The candle flickered, the wax dripping onto her fingers. Then she said quietly, Where will I go? He reached out, his hand hovering inches from hers, close enough to feel, not quite close enough to touch. Where the river leads. Evelyn glanced toward the open door. The mist moved like breath, and beneath it, she could see the reflection of moonlight trembling on the current. The air smelled of lilies. She stepped forward. The candle flame bent in the wind but didn't die. Samuel moved beside her, silent, patient, as the water reached the first step of the porch. When her feet met the cold, she gasped. It wasn't cruel. It was cleansing. Each step deeper felt like a weight lifting from her chest. The river rose to her knees, then her waist. Her dress floated around her like a pale bloom. Behind her, the house groaned. One final protest before the porch cracked, sinking slightly into the mud. Samuel's voice came again, gentle as rain. You're free now. She turned to him, tears mixing with river water. Will I see you again? He smiled. You already are. And then, as the water reached her shoulders, he was gone. Only the lilies remained, thousands of them, drifting downstream, their petals gleaming white beneath the moon. Evelyn let the candle fall. Its flame hissed once and vanished. The current took her, not with violence, but with the quiet pull of something ancient and sure. She closed her eyes, and the world dissolved into sound. The whisper of the current, the rhythm of her heartbeat, the distant song of something eternal. By morning, the house stood empty. Half of it had collapsed into the river, the other half sinking inch by inch with the soft patience of rot. The field was gone, the garden erased. Only the lilies marked where it had been, a thin, trembling constellation of white on the dark water. They said later that Evelyn Thorne vanished the way her husband did, taken by the river. But the old women in town, the ones who still whispered to their dead before sleep, told a different story. They said sometimes on quiet nights, you could see two figures standing by the river's mouth, a man and a woman side by side, hand in hand, their reflections moving in the water even when the wind was still. And when the lilies bloomed in spring, the river carried their petals downstream all the way to the sea, a promise kept. A love returned. A debt finally paid. The house was gone. The river remained. And somewhere beneath its endless murmur, two names, Evelyn and Samuel, drifted together into forever.